So to everyone who is here, I just want to say welcome from the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. My name is Annie. I'm the program coordinator at the Alliance, and this event, this wonderful talk tonight, is a kickoff for our Revolutionary War Living History Day that is going to take place on Saturday. Please forgive my dog. I have a year-old Springer Spaniel who is just talking to himself in the background. So if you hear a bark, it's him, and I'm just going to go ahead and apologize. Our Living History Day is on Saturday. Suzanne will be joining us in person. It's a two kind of faceted event where we will have reenactors in person, and we'll have reenactors in the back of the visitor center, and then we will have Suzanne in the front of the house. You can meet her, you can buy her books, and you can talk to her. And then we will have stuff online as well. So we have some virtual things, we'll have some videos, we have some articles people can read, and that will just be kind of posted forever, that people can kind of interact with that content as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Suzanne. She is an award-winning novelist from Florida who obviously now resides in North Carolina. Her mysteries transport readers to the Southern theater of the American Revolution, where she brings historic towns, battles, and people to life. She fuels her creativity with Revolutionary War reenacting and visits to historic sites like the Visitor Center in Hillsborough. When she's not writing, she enjoys cooking, dancing, and hiking. And she is the recipient of a professional development grant from the United Arts Council of Raleigh and Wake County. In 2018, she was appointed by North Carolina's Daughters of the American Revolution to a statewide committee formed by the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources to help share information about and coordinate events of America's upcoming 250th anniversary. So, Suzanne, I'm going to kick this off to you. Again, for those who have just gotten in, if you missed the very beginning, if you have a question, please type it at the bottom. Suzanne's going to talk, and she's going to show us some really cool stuff, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So, Suzanne, it's all you.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for the introduction. And I'd like to say good evening to everyone here. Thank you so much for coming. As Annie said, I will be on the front porch, actually, of the Dixon House in Hillsborough this Saturday. So please come by and introduce yourselves and say, hey, yeah, I was there on Wednesday night. So as Annie mentioned, I'm the author of an award-winning mystery series that's set in the American Revolution. Now, North Carolina isn't the usual setting that authors choose when they write about the American Revolution. I also break with tradition by making my main character, my detective, a British officer. But as we Americans approach our country's semi-quincentennial celebration in 2026, the time is perfect for us to explore these different angles while we reflect upon our 250 years of history as a nation. So late January 1781, 6 companies of redcoats from the 82nd Regiment of Foot, about 200 seasoned soldiers, sailed from Charleston, South Carolina. On the 28th of January, they landed 10 miles south of Wilmington, North Carolina, marched north, and occupied the town. They were there until mid-November, so they were there for almost a year. This piece of history is part of the vast Southern theater of the American Revolution. So this slide comes courtesy of John Robertson. John is retired from being a ranger at Cowpens National Battlefield. And John and I met during the 225th anniversary of the American Revolution. So we go back, about a quarter of a century. And John was one of those people who got out with the scholars and everything, and they stomped through the brush looking for musket balls and buttons to substantiate that South Carolina actually had, this was actually a battlefield. It was just a skirmish, but it was still a place where a battle was held. And John told me he decided he was going to plot every altercation of the American Revolution, of what we call the American Revolution, on a map and show them as yellow squares. So you notice that this is really interesting. Now, he said that there were no altercations in Antarctica, and I don't think there were any in Australia either. But when you look at this, it doesn't look like it's totally confined to the eastern part of the United States, which is sort of what we grew up to believe, at least in American history class. It looks almost like it could be a world war. And another thing I'd like to draw to your attention is if you look at the East Coast of the United States, it doesn't look like the Northern Theater has the lion's share of battles, does it? The Southern Theater was just as active and devastating as the Northern Theater. In fact, many scholars now agree that the colony or the state with the most battle action was South Carolina, not New York. And some of the scholars say that they feel that the American War of Independence was actually won in the South. If you haven't heard of the British occupation of Wilmington, you aren't alone. It isn't often taught in American history classes. As a result of this vacuum, when people hear the words war and the South, they think of the Civil War, or they think of Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, Virginia, as if that long and bloody siege represents the only military action in the South that's really worth looking at. The British occupation of Wilmington wasn't the finest hour for American patriots, but the story of this military action presents us with the opportunity to review what led up to the occupation of Wilmington and learn from a cautionary tale in our nation's history. Let's take a look. In 1775, North Carolina's Patriots ousted the final royal governor, Josiah Martin, from his residence in New Bern. The following year, in February 1776, they annihilated the largest military force of loyalists in North Carolina at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. In the following months, they severely persecuted loyalists. If you were a loyalist who wasn't killed or kicked out, it was because you kept your head down and your mouth shut. Thus, in early 1781, Patriots had been in charge of North Carolina for about 5 years. Most of the heavy war action was in surrounding states during that time, and Patriots in North Carolina got complacent. To make matters worse, the government was a slow-moving bureaucracy. It was tight with funding and supplies. Several times, Patriot militiamen who were stationed in Wilmington requested more ammunition, more arms, more men from the governor, but they never got enough of what they needed. Does this look like a setup for disaster to you? Well, there we go. All right, most of you will probably recognize this fellow. This is the commander of the Southern branch of the British Army, Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis had been focusing his attention on South Carolina. He was ever hopeful that he could rally loyalists, although he hadn't had much luck with that in South Carolina. He was erroneously convinced that loyalists could function autonomously if they just had a pep talk every now and then from British regulars. So his plan for 1781 was to recruit loyalists in North Carolina and use them to help him while he marched around the backcountry crushing rebellion. Cornwallis's plan hinged upon having a supply depot established in Cross Creek, North Carolina. Cross Creek is now called Fayetteville. This depot would provide him with an uninterrupted source of supplies while his army was busy in the interior of North Carolina. So in late 1780, the 82nd Regiment in Charleston was tapped to do the work of establishing the supply depot. Wilmington, North Carolina was a coastal port and had access, at least theoretically, to Cross Creek via the Cape Fear River. Thus, Wilmington is the location selected for the occupying regiment's command base. The commander of the 82nd Regiment was Major James Henry Craig. He wasn't one of those fluffy British officers that we see stereotyped in films. He was educated and he was a critical thinker. He had extensive campaign experience and he'd even been wounded in action. And Craig could think outside the box. The Patriots in North Carolina had spies in South Carolina. Well, everybody had spies everywhere. This was a very spy-heavy war. By early January 1781, the governor's office had received at least 2 messages from spies in Charleston, warning them that the British might be planning to occupy Wilmington. But the government in North Carolina ignored these tips, not grasping the significance of Wilmington as a port and assuming that the intensity of battle action in South Carolina and Virginia would continue to dominate the war in the South. The result of this flawed thinking was pandemonium when the 82nd Regiment arrived. Most civilians in Wilmington had less than a day to prepare themselves for the occupation. Town officials, hoping that the British would be lenient and merciful if they encountered no armed resistance, ordered the undermanned, outgunned militia to evacuate. A number of Patriot leaders who lived in the area scrambled to get out ahead of the Redcoats. This is William Hooper. He is one of North Carolina's 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he lived in the Wilmington area out on the Sound. So he wound up having to abandon his family in Wilmington. He rode away as fast as he could and escaped to the Hillsborough area. Other high-profile patriots like Cornelius Harnett and John Ashe were not as lucky. With the militia gone, Wilmington was defenseless. About 200 civilians, dock workers, merchants, artisans, and so forth, marched out to meet the British on the 28th of January. They surrendered their firearms and they were paroled. This act was ridiculed by patriots in other states, and I've actually encountered people who didn't believe the civilians would have surrendered without putting up some kind of a Red Dawn fight. This is this sort of history that you can expect from Hollywood. But you see, the residents of Wilmington were well aware that they faced seasoned regulars. Oops, hold on just a second. I'm missing a slide. Hang on. I'm sorry about this. There we go. The chaos of the first days of that occupation provides historical background for the murder mystery in book 1 of the Michael Stoddard series, Deadly Occupation. Within a few days of occupying Wilmington, Major Craig determined that access to Cross Creek was too dangerous and establishing the supply depot was unfeasible. He sent multiple messengers to an attempt to find Lord Cornwallis and advised him that they had to pivot their strategy. In book 2 of my series, Regulated for Murder, I send Michael Stoddard to Hillsborough, North Carolina, as one of these couriers, disguised as a civilian. In Hillsborough, echoes of the Regulator Rebellion haunt the residents a decade after 6 men were hanged there. Michael must wade through that history and use his detective skills to solve murders. And when he finally leaves town, he misses Cornwallis's occupation of Hillsborough by just a few days. Because, as we all know, those guys didn't have cell phones back then, right? The first time Cornwallis himself realized that there was no supply depot was when his army, whittled down by 25% and battered after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, limped into Cross Creek mid-March. With Patriot militia activity firing up across southeast North Carolina as a result of all that battle action, Cornwallis's army was forced to continue marching to Wilmington to get the supplies it needed. This history provides background in Book 3, A Hostage to Heritage. In Wilmington, Cornwallis told Craig that he hadn't found any loyalists in North Carolina. No supply depot, no loyalists. He pronounced the Wilmington campaign a failure. He said he was taking his army to Virginia, and he ordered Craig to pack up and return to Charleston. Cornwallis hadn't found North Carolina's loyalists because he didn't stick around any one place long enough to inspire their confidence. Remember, these were people who had been beaten down after Moore's Creek Bridge 5 years earlier. They were a tough sell. After Cornwallis left North Carolina in mid-April, Craig disobeyed his orders. He changed the goals for the entire occupation. Because the 82nd had been in Wilmington for several months, loyalists had come out of hiding to support the regiment. Craig had loyalists under his command. December 1781, combined forces of loyalists and the 82nd Regiment numbered approximately 1,000 fighting men for the king. Civil war raged in North Carolina as loyalists got revenge on patriots for how they'd suffered. The patriots had switched governors during that time, adding to their disorganization. The Continental Army was stymied, unable to transfer troops and supplies between Virginia and South Carolina overland easily because of the 82nd's influence. Book 4 of my series, Kill or Debt, is set during this bloody Civil War. It wasn't until the autumn of 1781 that the Patriot militia in North Carolina finally started developing cohesion. Even then, loyalists continued fighting for the king. That September, they made a daring raid on Hillsborough and captured Patriot Governor Thomas Burke, which was quite a blow to the Patriots. That's covered in Book 5, which is currently a work in progress. I know, teaser. At the same time that Cornwallis's forces were being surrounded in Yorktown, Patriots began surrounding the 82nd. They closed them into Wilmington with their only escape route, the sea. When Craig received confirmation that Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown, the British gambit in North Carolina was over. He packed up the 82nd and he returned to Charleston. During 1781, while the 82nd Regiment occupied Wilmington, it exploited multiple weaknesses in Patriot strategy, and it did this with only 200 regulars, their loyalist allies, and the fluid thinking of their commanding officer. Had Cornwallis not been pinned down and forced to surrender, British regiments in other states might have been actively encouraged to follow Craig's strategy with loyalists, and the war might have had a different outcome. So I'm writing the Michael Stoddard American Revolution mystery series because people learn history from reading historical fiction, and because I want readers to know about this crucial piece of North Carolina's history and what it represents. Plus, I'm also seeking funding to develop a series of short videos about North Carolina's lesser known Revolutionary War sites with the goal, like historic Hillsborough, with the goal to interest people in state history. I encourage you to use the coming 5 years to get involved in the community's plans for semi-quincentennial celebrations. Let's work together and make America's history more accessible and visible for the 250th anniversary. Thank you for listening, and I'd be delighted to answer questions now. I saw some good ones in there.
Thank you, Suzanne. I did want to note that William Hooper, you can visit his house. You can't go in, it's privately owned, but the William Hooper house is in Hillsborough, and you can go by and see it. And then part of William Hooper is buried in Hillsborough, and you can see his gravestone in Old Town Cemetery. And I say part because they did bury him, and then the poor man, they dug him up and moved part of his bones, I guess, somewhere else. So we have a part of Hooper, but not all of them, buried in Hillsborough. But you can go to the Old Town Cemetery and you can see his his gravestone there. That it's beautiful.
Yeah, that other part of him, that they moved him to Guilford Military Park.
Yeah.
And I think by the time they scooped him up and moved him back to Hillsborough, he was like mostly dust, the poor guy.
Yeah, the poor man. I mean, yeah, he's been exhumed multiple times, but we do have a marker for him in the cemetery in Hillsborough, and you can also drive by his house. It's a beautiful home, and it's been very, very lovingly restored. So we've got 3 questions that are very good. I have some questions, and then as we're talking, please, everyone, feel free to jump in, add some questions in here, and keep in mind too, Suzanne will be on site at the Visitor Center in Hillsborough, the Dixon House, on Saturday. So you can also ask her questions in person. And you can buy her books there. So the first question, in your opinion, why did many of the former regulators become loyalists during the Revolutionary War? And why did some of the North Carolinians who had sided with Governor Tryon become patriots? That's a good one.
Yeah. So I'm going to paraphrase what one of the guys said. He was a regulator, and he got bashed at the Battle of Alamance, and he got bashed at Moore's Creek Bridge too. And he made a comment along the lines of, I fought for my country and I fought for my king, and I got slammed both times. It was something like that. But I think one of the things about the regulators. So after Tryon came through, and there was the Battle of Alamance, and the regulator movement kind of got broken up and everything. His successor, who came in immediately afterwards, Josiah Martin, took a different approach and actually started listening to these people, and he began understanding, their grievances, where Tryon wasn't as good at doing that. And Josiah Martin actually wound up making some things better for people in the backcountry. And so a number of these loyalists, a number of these regulators or former regulators, became loyal to Josiah Martin versus being loyal to the king. And so Josiah Martin put out the call, like, to Moore's Creek Bridge, and he's like, we need help. Everybody who's loyal, we need you to rally, at this point on the coast. And so a lot of those former regulators came out then and joined with the Highlanders. And why did some of the North Carolinians who had sided with Governor Tryon become patriots? I think a lot of that comes down to like a personal creed that they might have had. Like William Hooper actually marched out with Tryon for the Battle of Alamance. And then he turned around just a couple of years later and signed the Declaration of Independence. Yeah. And this bothers a lot of people. And they're like, how could he have done that? And a lot of these, the patriots considered themselves to be citizens of Britain. They weren't actively trying to fight against the king for a long time. So there was a lot of gray area in there.
I think it also, just to kind of jump in there too, I think it also is a really good example of how complicated the revolution was. And, these are people who, like you said, who felt that they were British citizens, and just how unknown independence would be. And I think too, when we did our regulator event earlier in this fall, we were talking about the regulators didn't want a new government. They were mad about taxation. They weren't looking to overthrow the government. They weren't looking to really change any of that. They just didn't like the tax because it was unfair for them. And so, I think it kind of also shows kind of how this movement grows, and how, it kind of starts as these ripples of we're unhappy with taxation, and then it becomes, we might be just better off being independent.
Well, and I think the farther they got into it, the easier it was to make the split. So if we're talking about 1774, 75, people were still kind of skittish about saying, no, I want complete separation from England or Britain. And by the time, so give it another 5 or 6 years, and then a lot of people were saying, yes, they have to go.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, it grows over time, and
Yeah.
you kind of you can trace that with these kind of early ripples into this kind of growing movement. This next question is: since North Carolina loyalists had their own agenda of revenge against their patriot neighbors, rather than aiding the British military effort, how do you think Cornwallis could have harnessed their support more effectively?
Well, his big problem was that he never sat down. I don't think he understood where they were coming from to begin with. So he never stayed in one place long enough. He never really talked to them. He would come into a place and he'd plant the standards and he'd say things like, all right, everybody here who loves the king, come on out and let's talk about it. Talk about how much you love King George. And I mean, at first people did that, but then they saw that when he left town, your neighbors came out and they're like, okay, so you're for King George, huh? And then you'd find out your cow went missing, your crops would get burned or something like that. So loyalists, pretty much when Cornwallis would come in there and give his spiel, loyalists would just stay quiet. They weren't going to out themselves. It was, that would have been crazy for them to do that. I don't know that Cornwallis had the type of personality to really understand them and to work with them. I think that was just, there was a dynamic there that wasn't they didn't sync with what he wanted. And he had all these expectations of them that they just couldn't possibly reach.
He seems fairly arrogant in general, that I feel like, and I think keep in mind that, Hillsborough was kind of on that line of the backcountry. And so, Cornwallis, to me, at least, I always think of Cornwallis as mixing with these kind of, upper class gentility, kind of in Wilmington, he would go to these kind of big parties with the kind of top of society. Whereas, Hillsborough didn't really have that. It was a lot of farmers and stuff like that at that time. So it seems like he kind of also misunderstood his audience especially when he was trying to come out to, Hillsborough and further west to find people. It just didn't mix. But if you come to Hillsborough, you can see the rumor is that the pavers outside of the Colonial Inn were originally laid by Cornwallis and his troops. They were like the original, I think, paved street that they put down. Those pavers are rumored to be by Cornwallis. Now, whether that's true, I don't know, but it is a town rumor, and you can see and decide for yourself if you come to Hillsborough, and you can take a look.
Well, I know he did sleep in both of those two houses across the street that are still there. And there was a third house, a third structure that's been torn down. So, they all ought to have little signs out there that said General Cornwallis slept here.
Although after the movie The Patriot, I don't know how many people are excited about Cornwallis because he's kind of a
his name is everywhere, though.
Yeah, people know him. Yeah.
he is respected as a general. He just messed up at Yorktown.
Yeah.
He did better in India afterwards. So then, so Nils keeps asking questions here.
These are great questions.
I know.
Do you think Tarleton tends to get too much of a bad reputation for his ruthlessness? Were there any British or loyalist officers in the South who you believe were far worse than Tarleton? That's a good one.
So the Victorians came through for the centennial and they kind of rewrote the American Revolution a bit. And that was when Tarleton really got the bad reputation. I mean, he, the Waxhaws and everything like that. Yes, people didn't like him too much, but the Victorians came through and they rewrote the history. And then people really hated Tarleton after that. I don't think he was any worse than a lot of partisan leaders. William Washington was pretty bad, George Washington's cousin. It was what we're talking about is at that point in the war in the Southern theater, it had become total war. We're way at the end of the war. Everybody's tired. They don't have enough to eat. They're running out of supplies and they're just mean as rattlesnakes, everybody on both sides. And, you capture your opponent's supply train, then they'd go around, and 2 weeks later and they'd capture one of yours. And it was just a mess. I think it was very easy to point fingers at specific leaders and say, this person was a devil or whatever. So I don't know. I think there was a bunch of them that just on both sides that practiced that total war.
Yeah.
And
well, and it's from my understanding too, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the South, it was much more of a guerrilla warfare than in the North, and it was more of a neighbor versus neighbor, because there were more loyalists down in the South. And so it was, and that also could be why Cornwallis had a hard time getting people, kind of recruiting people down here, is because no one wanted to say I'm a loyalist. But there certainly were quite a few down here. And so, speaking of the Patriot, I mean, Charlton certainly gets a really bad rap in that movie. But yeah. Okay, so the next one, do you think another reason could be that the Patriot leaders, who were largely plantation elites, feared a grassroots social revolution and felt that they could avert that by taking leadership of the independence movement?
Huh. Boy,
I've heard this before. This is a great question.
Okay, so I don't have any thoughts on this. This is the first time I've encountered this. What do you say to this, Annie?
So from what if Nils, I think that's how you say your name. There is a book about this, specifically in Virginia. And of course, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the book, but there is a book about this, and I have read it. I read it in grad school, and it's really good. And so it's basically this idea that and according to this book, each state or each colony at this point had a very specific reason to go along with the revolution. And in Virginia specifically, these planters wanted to relieve their debts. And so they supported it because they knew that they could erase, like George Washington specifically was deeply in debt. He didn't want to pay the tax collector. And so they wanted to erase that. And so they supported this to try to kind of gain control for themselves and have more control over trade and more control over the government. And again, erase kind of whatever they owed to these British merchants. I think, I don't know, you could see some of it. I've also read too that it was the kind of like the class underneath the elites that also wanted this, because they pushed the planters into going for this revolution because they knew that they would get more rights that way. They wanted more power, they wanted more control, they wanted more money, and they wanted rights that they wouldn't have had underneath the British Empire. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I've seen a fair amount of kind of like scholarship on this, but I haven't seen enough, I think, evidence to really, I think you can go either way. I could see, personally, I think there's kind of a mix, and I think it's really hard because I think, a lot of times we forget that the colonies were not cohesive at all. I mean, they were all doing completely different. They were like literally like little mini countries just kind of operating on their own. And they were connected in different ways. North Carolina was trading with Virginia and stuff like that. But, in the North, I think this is not what was going on. In the North, I think it was a lot more of this kind of, intellectual, philosophical kind of movement picking up steam, whereas in the South, I do think that there was some of this going on in the South, but I don't know. I also think we have to remember there weren't that many plantation elites at this time either, especially in North Carolina, there weren't that many.
Just in the southeastern part.
Yeah. I mean, they're on the coast. Virginia, there certainly were more plantations, very, very wealthy plantations. In South Carolina, you have the same. But North Carolina, I mean, most of our plantations at this point are really going to be on the coastal region.
Yeah, because the farther you got inland, the more you got into groups like the Quakers, that they didn't have anything to do with slavery. And you found fewer and fewer slaves the farther inland you went.
Yeah, but Niles, there is a there's a book. It's by Woody somebody. If you come find me, if you come on Saturday, I will have the name of the book. It is excellent. It is on that question exactly. And it's really, really good. It focuses on Virginia, but it's a really interesting question that this book attempts to answer, that you might find interesting. And I'm Annie. So if anyone is there on Saturday, I will be there. Suzanne will be there. So the next question, since the British, yeah, since the British promised freedom to slaves who took up arms against the Patriots, did a significant number of North Carolina slaves join the British Army or the Loyalist guerrilla forces? That's a really good question.
So I know that there was an entire regiment of Blacks that, wait a minute, no, that was it. They were actually fighting for the Patriots. All right, did we lose Sarah? Are you still there? I mean, did we, Annie? Oh, okay. I don't know about North Carolina specifically in terms of the percentage of slaves that joined the British Army. I do know that Major Craig had slaves that joined, that came and helped, and a lot of them served as scouts. Did you find the book?
No, I have it. I'll find it. I promise. I will get it. I was looking to see if it was in my bookcase. It's not.
So do you know whether what percentage of North Carolina slaves joined the British Army? Or,
I don't think it was very many. There weren't, from my understanding, there weren't that many. Out of the rest of the colonies, there weren't all that many slaves in North Carolina. There were clearly slaves here, but it wasn't a ton in comparison to like South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, stuff like that. But there is a book, another book, about kind of this and the role of runaway slaves and Native Americans during the Revolution. It's called Independence Lost by, I think, Kathleen Duval, and it is excellent. And it does talk about that. Now, I don't know, it's not specific to North Carolina. It talks kind of about runaway slaves in general, because a lot of them did run to the British Army because they thought that they would, get their freedom that way. And a lot of them did not end up getting their freedom, or they were sent on a boat, and then some of them were sent to Canada and some of them were brought back.
So I picked up a story. I found a story, and I don't know, I need to track it down and see whether or not it's actually true. But William Hooper had a woman slave named Lavinia that supposedly when the British left Wilmington, they told people, they said, anybody here who wants to come with us, you're welcome to come with us. And Lavinia tried to get on board one of their boats, and people still on shore said, no, you can't do that. She belongs to William Hooper. So she couldn't get away. And that would have been actually what happened for other slaves that had not been manumitted. If they were still, property, then eventually they'd be tracked down.
Yeah, and I think too, you see this in the Civil War as well, where, the slaves were really, they were treated as contraband. And they were also, they were seen as property. And so there was a lot of kind of conversation as to whether or not the British could use the slaves and in what capacity. And it was kind of this like really complicated question for what we all know is a horrifying conversation, which is about, these people who are being treated as property. But there was a lot of that, of, feeling like they couldn't, allow enslaved to do certain things because of the fact that, they were considered property and all sorts of stuff. But it's a good question, and one that clearly Suzanne and I are not quite sure of. But it could be in the book. I know the book Independence Lost is about that, and the British use of Native Americans and enslaved laborers. And a lot of it too, a lot of Native Americans in general sided with the British because they thought that they were going to win. And so they felt that they were going to get a better outcome if they sided with the winning side, and that they were going to treat them better anyway.
Well, the British actually did treat them better
They did,
than the
yeah.
Patriots did. And King George said, here, don't go farther west than this line. If you go farther west than this line and try to settle, then I can't be responsible for what happens. That's their land. And, at least he tried to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Americans were like, oops, what line?
Yeah.
That's not real. So another question. Chatham County is celebrating its own 250th anniversary this year. What did William Pitt, aka Lord Chatham, do that made him worthy of this honor in the minds of the people of this new county?
Well, this is totally out of my wheelhouse, so I started Googling.
Good, because I have no idea. I don't know.
Google is your friend.
Google is a best friend.
Let's see. I don't know. It says that he was a British statesman of the Whig group who served as a prime minister of Great Britain in the middle of the 18th century. I don't know if that necessarily endeared him to people. I don't know, did he own that piece of land?
I don't know. I know Pitt was the one, I thought they had hated Pitt. But I don't know. I know in general, they did name, all over the colonies, they named counties and towns and stuff like that after these, kind of British people. But William Pitt,
here we go. Pitt is best known as the wartime political leader of Britain in the 7 Years' War, especially for his single-minded devotion to victory over France. Maybe that's what it was.
That would make sense. And because North Carolina, there were some skirmishes and battles for the French, and what we call the French and Indian War, which is AKA the 7 Years' War. Right. There were battles here in the western part of the state against the Native Americans. And it was, there were quite a few Native Americans, but North Carolinians who were killed. And we also did, North Carolinians, we did send people up to help Virginia fight the Native Americans as well. And so that would make sense if that's what Chatham County is.
And so you just answered Nils's next question.
Oh, I found the book, by the way. It is called, now I'm going to forget, Forced Founders by Woody Holton. That is the book that talks about the gentry forcing independence, because they're forced the planting class to kind of go for independence. That's what the book is about. It's short, but it's really good. How did North Carolina's Appalachian region experience the war? So
yes, as Annie says, there were a lot of clashes back in that area. And oh my gosh, I've forgotten the name of, it's right in the tip of my tongue, the name of the Cherokee leader that led raids back and forth in that area. You know who I'm talking about?
It's the same thing. I know who you're talking about, but I can't remember his name.
Yeah. And the settlers back then finally had to make some kind of treaty or peace pact with them.
They did. I'm Googling now. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember his name, but yeah, there were lots of skirmishes. From my understanding of it, there were lots of skirmishes, and in the Northeast, it was more battles. From my understanding, my reading, Northeast, there are going to be more battles, and it's going to be more the colonists going up against the British, where down further south, it's more of they're fighting along the frontier. There are going to be battles, obviously, against the British Army, but there are lots of little like skirmishes and stuff like that against the Native Americans. Because remember, at the Northeast at this point, most of the Native Americans up there are gone. They've left. They've been forcibly removed. They're not really up there where they're fighting in the way that we think of it, especially down in the South. So yeah, it would have been, I think, just kind of more of the colonists were fighting along the frontier And my dog is playing with the toy, excuse him. He's having a really good time tonight. So it would be more skirmishes with the Native Americans, and in that region too, there were a lot of Scottish settlers who were living there.
Those were the lowland Scots.
Yeah.
Because the Highlanders came down into the like the Fayetteville area.
Yeah. But if you've seen Outlander, they cover some of that. Yeah.
Oh, you have one more.
Oh, what was the name of the book? Forced Founders by Woody Holton. North Carolina Press, UNC Press prints it. It's not super long. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. And again, it talks about whether or not it's kind of this theory that the middle class, this gentry, forced the hand of the upper class, the planting elites, like George Washington is in it, Thomas Jefferson. They kind of are the ones who force this because the elite want power. They want to erase their debts. It's a great book. It's really interesting. And I actually had a question for you, Suzanne. So then I promise we might be questioned out. So the British, my understanding, the British wanted to split the South from the Northeast. If they had been successful in doing that, do you think that the outcome of the war would have been the same?
The British wanted to split the South from the Northeast?
Yeah, so apparently they felt that from what I've read, they wanted to split this kind of Anaconda plan where they wanted to they felt like the problem was in New England. And if they could cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, they felt like it would be
okay. I see where you're going with that. So yeah, they always did feel like there were more loyalists down in the South. I don't know. That's a speculative kind of.
I know.
Yeah. It's interesting because you find a lot more sentiment in the South for British even now.
Yeah.
So, and they even think that the accents of people in the South versus people in the North reflect different parts of Britain.
Oh, that's interesting. Which makes sense. It does make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like North and South.
Yeah.
So what was the tail end of your question? It was how did I think
do you think that would have changed the outcome if they could have cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, or if the Caribbean had joined the side of the Patriots?
Okay.
That would have changed things.
So one of the things that happened to discourage that was that the Patriots were really good at terrorism.
Yes.
They split. Yeah. They kept loyalists in the South and Native Americans and slaves. They kept those three groups, which would have joined with the British Army. They kept those three groups from being able to talk to each other and work together. If they had not been so good at terrorism and keeping them apart, then we would have had something like 30,000 fighting men for the king, in addition to British regulars. So yes, it would have been, we could have had quite a different outcome there. We keep losing attendees. I guess they're getting bored.
No, it happens. They trickle out, kind of ask
So did I answer your question though?
Yes, you did.
Jim Pikuch has a book that talks about that. I cannot think of the title right offhand. His last name is Piekuch.
Okay.
Jim Pikuch. It's a big, thick book on that whole premise about those three groups that the Patriots kept apart.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and for again, those of you who visit us on Saturday, Suzanne and I will have all the titles of the books we could not remember tonight. So you can come find us and we will tell you. So thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Please come see us. We're at the Visitor Center, which is the Alexander Dixon House in Hillsborough. We will be there from 10 to 4 and on Saturday. And for those of you who are not local, you can visit all of our stuff online. We will also, this has been recorded, so I will be sending out a recording in the next few days of our talk tonight. Suzanne, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.
Have a wonderful evening, and hopefully we'll see everybody on Saturday.
Bye-bye.
Bye.